From the Anthropocene to the Capitalocene to the Cthulhucene, from optimistic eco-modernist geoengineers to Malthusian doomsday prophets, the Academy is teeming with treatises on the so-called Age of Humans. With the rise of the Anthropocene concept came the rise of its critics, including those within indigenous studies who see the, quote, Age of Humans as a regurgitation or perversion of an ancient worldview in which humans have always been profoundly intertwined with the rest of nature. But these arguments are more than academic squabbles. The stakes are high. As the competing Anthropocene narratives struggle to gain purchase outside of academia, reactionary settler colonial political movements are on the rise, threatening indigenous sovereignty and ecosystem conservation. Nearly 20 years ago, Arturo Escobar wrote that we were faced with the growing realization that any alternative course of action must take into account place-based models of nature, culture, and politics, a move that would serve as a critique of Eurocentrism and a recognition of indigenous worldviews. In this presentation, I explore the implications of that realization. What does it mean to acknowledge place in the, quote, Age of Humans? And what does this teach us about intercultural solidarity in a time of rupture and dispersal? I'm speaking to you today from Columbus, Ohio, USA, a city named after Christopher Columbus, who is perhaps the single figure most associated with settler colonialism, at least in the American context. When I moved here 2 years ago, I spent a good deal of time learning about the history of settler colonialism in Ohio, a history that resulted in a state with no federally recognized tribes and no reservations. How could I, or anyone, connect with indigenous culture in Ohio without a reservation, or nation, or territory, or place? There was seemingly no indigenous authority for me, a non-native person, to turn to. Despite the extensive archaeological evidence of thousands of years of indigenous habitation in Ohio, the current indigenous presence was barely perceptible to me, like a whisper. So I want to share with you what I've learned about my new place, Columbus, Ohio, in the short time that I've been here. There's evidence of continuous indigenous occupation of the area we know today as Ohio that traces back many thousands of years. In particular, mound-building cultures left a lasting impact on the land through their mounds and earthworks. Most or all of Ohio had been, for at least hundreds of years, managed as a commons in accordance with the dish with one spoon agreement by the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, including the Potawatomi, Ottawa, and Chippewa, and the Shawnee. The Wyandot, Lenape, Miamia, and perhaps others also have historical ties to various parts of the state. Some or all of these groups may have also participated in the dish with one spoon agreement. Post-European contact, political and economic tensions led to increased movement westward by indigenous groups who also attempted to slow settler expansion through treaty negotiations. But indigenous armed resistance to Euro-American settlement was a consistent feature of the 18th century. Resistance in Ohio peaked in 1791, but continued well into the 19th century, notably by Tecumseh and the Shawnee people, even though treaties had been signed that ceded almost all indigenous land in Ohio to the United States. This is a sign that the Indian land cessions, which were what the treaties were called, were not considered mutually beneficial, which is the intent of a treaty, but instead signed under duress and as a result of military occupation. In 1797, the first Euro-American settlement was built in what is today Columbus, and the city was officially incorporated in 1812. The end of the War of 1812 meant that the British would no longer provide military support to the Shawnee resistance. And in the wake of that, and as well as with the Indian Removal Act of 1830, indigenous resistance in Ohio was basically snuffed out as waves of American settlers flooded the landscape. Over the past 150 years, the population of the Columbus metropolitan area has increased from roughly 3,500 settlers to over 2 million. And like many other American cities, the city of Columbus has appropriated, erased, and assimilated the area's native history into the settler narrative of American exceptionalism. We see that in the names of sports teams and mascots, as well as in the name of the city itself. Christopher Columbus represents disease, humiliation, destruction of culture and living conditions, and mass death and genocide for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. So sadly, the history of Columbus, Ohio is similar to that of so many other places that once represented new frontiers for settler colonial expansion. I'm sure you're all familiar with Patrick Wolf's assertion that the purpose of settler colonialism is destruction in order to replace, and through that process, settler colonialism becomes the dominant structure. We can imagine this process spatially through settler land grabs and border construction which collapse space for indigenous peoples. In the words of Candice Fujikane, the settler state and developers fragment and isolate land into smaller and smaller parcels until it can claim that the land has no longer cultural significance or ecological significance. This process, which encloses the commons, the exact opposite of the dish with one spoon understanding, and transforms it into a private property regime, is described in William Cronin's seminal work, Changes in the Land. Early European settlers in post-contact New England began to construct fences to designate private property and contain privately owned livestock, writes Cronin. Sometimes, however, the settlers' pigs would escape, and native people would hunt them. As a commons, these animals were viewed as free game. Property rights didn't exist until the moment of the kill, but settlers disagreed, and using their justice system to argue for compensation for their lost livestock, over time, and in order to resolve conflict, native people in the area began to discipline themselves to compensate settler farmers for their escaped livestock. As such, the concept of land as private property under the rule of law became internalized by many native people. This example shows how the objective dimensions of settler colonialism, like enacting borders, produce subjective dimensions like the internalization of and participation in private property regimes. But in addition to thinking about settler colonialism spatially, we can also think about it temporally, and I think that's a particularly interesting way to address the Anthropocene concept. Just as settler colonial societies construct borders around the land, so too do they construct borders around time. Mark Rifkin calls this the denial of indigenous temporal sovereignty, meaning that there's only one authoritative reading of history. By contrast, Rifkin urges us to think of time as plural, less as a temporality than temporalities. Here Rifkin is pushing us to consider the many diverse examples of indigenous conceptions of time. For example, we might look to Ingela Bergman's work with the Sami, which reveals that, quote, distances in the past were not ascribed any significant value and that there was no chronological or genealogical scale against which events in the past were measured. Or Richard Preston's work and his examination of Cree understanding of time, which he presents as cyclical, intertwined with seasons, changes in weather, and human and animal behavior. There are many notions of time, and there are many ways to read history. Maintaining and reinforcing a singular lens of settler time, therefore, eliminates the possibility and promise of intercultural solidarity as it attempts to enact and enforce static boundaries around the relationship between people, place, and time. Of course, human beings are dynamic in our relation to time and place. In the words of V.F. Cordova, time is an abstraction derived from the fact that there is motion and change in the world. In this sense, although settler time represents the dominant paradigm, it also represents a restriction of the human spirit. Interestingly, we can find similar observations in the work of the German social theorist Walter Benjamin, who was critical of the European vision of time as progress, in which history is always and only linear. Benjamin looked to disrupt this notion by invoking the idea of revolution. He said the Great Revolution introduced a new calendar. Inspired by Benjamin, Alberto Vallejo Reyna describes revolution as, quote, not the locomotive of history, not the driving force of history, but rather its handbrake. In this way, Benjamin's account is compatible with Rifkin's criticism of settler time. You might say that according to this logic, revolution is not only breaking the notion of progress as in a handbrake, but also breaking the notion of progress into many directions, many places, and many times. The Anthropocene concept is another manifestation of settler time. You could say that following Walter Benjamin, the Anthropocene is a locomotive of linear progression, albeit settler colonial and capitalist progression. It's an attempt to bracket the newest epoch, during which humanity has written itself into the surface of the earth, with a beginning and a forecasted end. The existential question that we're asking now is, how do we break or stop the Anthropocene? Or perhaps we must concurrently ask, how do we break or shatter the Anthropocene concept? Of course, these are questions for all of us to grapple with. As Heather Davis and Zoe Todd write, at least the Anthropocene concept has been helpful in allowing us to see the root of the problem, which they call the, quote, severing of relations through the brutality of colonialism, coupled with an imperial universal logic. And so I think that by engaging with the Anthropocene concept, we can begin to see how also to dismantle it, to reestablish relations or to create new relations in the midst of or in spite of the continued settler colonial structure. There are many examples of indigenous groups leading the way in this regard. My dissertation research was conducted in part with groups of allies supporting the Zapatistas of southern Mexico, who famously say, "We want a world in which many worlds fit." And that includes time also. Part of the Zapatista project is the creation of what they call other calendars and other geographies, or different notions of time and space that would not reproduce the same historicist notions of progress. One symbolic representation of this project lies within the Zapatista central communities, which they call caracoles, or snail shells, which use their shape, or a spiral, as an organizational principle. It has many meanings, but one of them, again, is the break from a linear worldview. This is part of a broader political vision, which they call Zapatismo, that is now being experimented with across North America by groups of adherentes, which is the title used by people who are adherents of the political vision of Zapatismo, but are not indigenous and do not live in Zapatista communities. In my fieldwork, I spoke with adherentes who are all attempting to implement a version of Zapatismo in their own communities across North America. Over the last 2 decades, they've gradually moved away from providing material support based on the needs and wants of Zapatista communities in Chiapas and towards an autonomy model in which they attempt to recreate the political vision developed in Chiapas in their own communities. They're wondering what it would mean to imagine themselves as caracoles, as autonomous snails, slowly finding their way within the heart of what the Zapatistas call the capitalist hydra. And so I think that clarifies why I began the presentation with an explanation of my home city. In my case, engaging with my place in the Anthropocene means starting to cultivate a deep understanding of my home, Ohio, and my relation to it as a first step toward intercultural solidarity. In other words, I begin at home. After all, when troubling a concept like the Anthropocene, perhaps there's no better place to begin than home.